Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and today we're going to be talking about the BACB's 5th edition task list item G-8, use chaining. First, it's worthwhile to just talk about what is a behavior chain. A behavior chain is a linked sequence of responses leading to a terminal outcome such that the outcome of each response serves as both conditioned reinforcement for that response that has just occurred and also serves as a discriminative stimulus, or SD, for the next response in the chain. So every step that occurs, there's some outcome right after that step that provides reinforcement for that step that was just completed, but also that reinforcement serves as an SD for the next step that now has to be completed as part of the chain. Now, in order for something to be a behavior chain, there has to be a sequence of discrete responses. Those responses have to be performed in a specific order and in close temporal succession. So there has to be a specific order that they come in, and they have to come one right after the next. And the performance of each step has to result in some kind of stimulus change that serves as that conditioned reinforcement for the step that was just completed, as well as an SD for the next step. So why would we use chaining? Chaining can help individuals learn complex tasks that promote independence. Often we may have chains that have multiple steps to them that would be very complex and might be difficult to expect an individual to be able to learn the entire task if reinforcement was only being provided for completion of the entire task. And so in this way we can sort of break down that complex task into smaller steps. Chaining also allows for a series of discrete behaviors to be combined and lead to reinforcement, and it can be combined with other procedures to build intricate and adaptive repertoires. Now, it's important when we're talking about behavior chains to also talk about task analysis. And a task analysis involves breaking a complex task into smaller, teachable units, which can be sequentially ordered and taught. So we use task analyses in applied behavior analysis to determine the steps that will make up our behavior chains. So behavior chaining is actually going to be the process of teaching all of those steps that are involved in completing a task, but the task analysis is actually analyzing the task at hand and breaking it down into those small steps to see what are all the steps that are involved in completing this task proficiently. So there are basically 4 different ways to construct and validate a task analysis. Number 1, we can observe a competent performer. So we can take a look at someone that we know is able to engage in the task, do it well, do it competently, and we can observe what they do and write down the steps that they follow. We can also perform the task ourselves, and as we're doing that, also record and write down the steps that are involved. This is assuming that we're, of course, competent at being able to perform the task. We could also obtain expert input, so basically ask someone who we know is qualified and competent at completing the task. What are the steps that are involved in this task? Or we can just do it through trial and error, putting together our task analysis, seeing how it actually goes, and making changes and modifications as we go. Realistically, we may find that this trial and error may play a role in some of the other ways of constructing a task analysis as well, because we have to make sure that the analysis that we've developed maps on to what's reasonable for our learner. And if we find that it's not, we may need to make changes. So before using behavior chaining, let's say we've done our task analysis, we know the steps that are involved in completing a task proficiently, and we're getting ready now to teach a learner how to complete those steps. It's important before we begin the process of teaching that we assess mastery level. We take our baseline data, see where our learner is currently at. And there are 2 ways to achieve this. We can do it through the single opportunity method, or we can do it through the multiple opportunity method. In a single opportunity method, the learner is expected to engage in all of the steps in the behavior chain. However, once one step is performed incorrectly or isn't performed, all the remaining steps in the chain are scored as incorrect. You essentially stop the taking of data. And you say, oh, there's a step that was wrong. We know these steps have to be completed in order. You got one wrong, so we just stop right there. And everything after that is scored as incorrect. This is a more conservative approach. It's going to lead to baseline data that is going to have a lower percentage in theory than the multiple opportunity method. It also takes less time to conduct because as soon as one step is performed incorrectly or not performed, you stop the assessment. But it also, because of that, it provides less information because it's possible that there could be steps after that incorrect step that the person would perform correctly that you never get to see in the single opportunity method. Now, with the multiple opportunity method, the learner is expected to engage in all of the steps in the behavior chain, but if a step is performed incorrectly or not performed, that step is completed for the learner by the person that's doing the assessment, and then the assessment continues. So you see, if there are other steps, despite that one step being completed incorrectly, if there are other steps that the learner might be able to complete correctly. And using the multiple opportunity method gives us more information because we get data on every single step in the chain. It does take longer because we're not stopping at the first incorrect step. And it does carry with it the risk of commingling assessment and teaching. Because we're going back and completing that step and then moving on, it's possible that some learning may take place during the assessment process. And if we think about that from a practical standpoint, if our goal is to help our learners acquire new skills, that's not such a big deal, right? It's actually potentially even beneficial. However, obviously, if what we're doing is research, there's some risk involved if teaching takes place during our assessment phase. So once we've done our assessment, we need to actually go about teaching, and there are multiple methods of using chaining to teach the steps in a task analysis. The first one is forward chaining. And in forward chaining, behaviors are taught in their naturally occurring order. Reinforcement begins with step 1, then progresses to step 1 followed by step 2, then step 1 followed by step 2 followed by step 3, etc., until ultimately the entire behavior chain is being performed. So if we think about an example of this, let's say that we're looking to teach someone how to brush their teeth, and we want to use a forward chaining method of doing that. And let's say that the first 3 steps that are involved in brushing your teeth, let's say that step 1 is picking up the tube of toothpaste. Let's say that step 2 is taking the cap off of the tube of toothpaste. Step 3 is putting the cap down on the counter. And then obviously a whole bunch of other steps that are going to be involved in brushing one's teeth. If we're using a forward chaining approach, literally we're going to start with the person picks up the tube of toothpaste, we provide reinforcement, and we're done, right? And then once reliably, when we go into the bathroom, if that's where we're brushing teeth, once reliably we go into the bathroom and the person's picking up the tube of toothpaste independently, then we move on to, they go into the bathroom, they pick up the tube of toothpaste, they unscrew the cap. Now we provide reinforcement for that. Once the toothpaste has been picked up and the cap comes off, we provide reinforcement and we stop, right? And then once they're reliably doing those first 2 steps, then we move on to the 3rd step, and so on and so on. So advantages of using an approach, using a forward chaining approach, is that it can be used to link smaller chains into larger ones. We can teach a number of relatively short chains that might be part of a terminal behavior and then link them together. It's relatively easy, and it can be combined with other behavior change procedures. But there are some limitations to a forward chaining approach. There's the risk of failing to reinforce or practice earlier steps once the chain starts to get really long. And that carries with it a risk of extinction because some of those earlier steps are not necessarily contacting reinforcement or are reliant on that conditioned reinforcement. And if that's not really strong, we may end up placing those earlier steps on extinction. And it may take longer than needed, as you can imagine. If we're spending multiple trials just reinforcing picking up that tube of toothpaste, maybe there's a more efficient way that we can go about teaching a behavior chain. A second method, which is a variation of forward chaining, is called total task chaining. And this is where training is provided on every step during every session. And assistance or prompting is provided for any step that is unable to be completed independently, but then we go ahead and we progress to the next step. Okay, so if we go back to our toothbrushing example and we had those first several steps of picking up the tube of toothpaste, taking off the cap, putting the cap down on the counter, right? Let's say that we had our learner came into the bathroom, picked up the tube of toothpaste, but then didn't go to take the top off of the tube of toothpaste. We might provide a prompt, maybe just a verbal prompt of take off the top of that tube of toothpaste. Maybe it's a physical prompt to guide their hand to do it. But then once that top comes off, then we move on to the next step and assess, are they able to put the top down on the counter? And if they don't, we provide prompting for that step. And then maybe the next step is, you pick up the toothbrush, right? So we would go through every step in the chain, providing assistance on the steps that need it or prompting on the steps that need it. But we're going through every step of the task analysis during every session. And in this case, these individual sessions may be longer. I mean, realistically, they are going to be longer than a forward chaining approach because we're going through the entire task analysis. And some learners may struggle with that prompting, especially learners who don't respond well to physical prompting if that's required, or they may develop error patterns because they're consistently doing something that's not consistent with the task analysis that we're having to correct all the time. But it may lead to quicker and or more easily identifiable progress because where every single step is being taught on every single trial, there's the opportunity for some of those steps to be learned more quickly. And frankly, if there are steps that get learned or that start to be engaged in independently, we're going to be able to see it because we're actually getting to those steps. Whereas with a forward chaining approach, it may be multiple sessions before we get to some of these steps. And then finally, a third method of chaining is backward chaining. And in backward chaining, all of the behaviors in the chain are completed by the trainer except for the final response. When the learner performs that final response, reinforcement is then delivered. So this then proceeds backward, with the learner then performing the final 2 steps before reinforcement is delivered, then the final 3 steps before reinforcement is delivered. So again, if we go to our toothbrushing example, let's say that the last steps that are involved in the task analysis of toothbrushing. Let's say that the final step is wiping your mouth with a towel. Okay. Let's say that the step before that is picking up the towel. Okay. And let's say that the step before that is taking the toothbrush that's in your hand and putting the toothbrush down on the counter. Okay, if we're using backward chaining, we're going to start with hanging up the towel. Okay, so we do all the other steps all through the process. We provide whatever support is necessary to get all the way through the process, and then basically we're just looking for the learner to hang up the towel, and then we provide reinforcement. And then after that, we back up one step to having to wipe one's mouth and then hang up the towel. Okay, and then we provide a reinforcement again for the hanging up the towel, but they have to wipe the mouth first and then hang up the towel. And then we go one step further. Now they have to pick up the towel, wipe the mouth, hang the towel back up, and now reinforcement is delivered. And we keep working backward one step at a time. You know, once the learner achieves competent performance on that final step, then those final 2 steps, then those final 3 steps, etc. And advantages of backward chaining is that the learner contacts the chain's terminal reinforcer on every learning opportunity, which basically means that we're always in a place where the last step is being done and then reinforcement is being delivered, which is ultimately when reinforcement is going to be delivered once the learner has the entire behavior chain in their repertoire, as opposed to a forward chaining approach where we're delivering reinforcement at some intermediate part of the behavior chain when it's not actually going to occur. So we're constantly shifting when reinforcement is occurring with forward chaining. Another advantage is that repeated pairing with reinforcement of each step can increase that stimulus discrimination. However, there are some limitations to backward chaining. First, similar to forward chaining, it can be pretty time consuming because we're doing each step individually, independently for a number of sessions before moving on. And the passive participation of the learner may limit responding because, especially in the beginning, the vast majority of the steps are being completed for the learner. There are limited opportunities for responding. So we've got these three methods: forward chaining, total task presentation, backward chaining. How do we choose which one we want to use? Well, there's no firm data to indicate that one method is better than another. So because of that, it's worthwhile to consider individual preferences, skills, and learning styles. Does a learner tend to respond better to one of these methods than another? Do they tend to prefer one to another? And some factors that we might want to consider related to that would be: what is a learner's ability to tolerate physical guidance? What's a learner's attention span? What's the total amount of training time available? And that could be how much time is available for any one session, because we know that forward chaining and backward chaining individual sessions take less time than total task. But as far as the total amount of time as measured in days or weeks or months to learn a skill, total task presentation may be more efficient in terms of the overall number of sessions required to achieve mastery. And ultimately, total task may be most appropriate when the learner can perform several steps already, when they have an imitative repertoire, so we can prompt using modeling as opposed to needing to get into physical prompting, and when the task sequence is not overly long or complex. But again, all three of these methods can be effective chaining procedures. It's just determining what's going to work best in your individual situation.